starving children. My mother whispered a prayer for our safety, but I saw their faces and thought, they were actually so kind. We had been told they were monsters. We never knew these men of the 26th Infantry Division were breaking their own army's rules. An official order forbade them from sharing any rations with Germans. The food they gave me was the first meat I had tasted in months. It was a quiet act of mercy that could have gotten them punished. When kindness itself is a crime, who are you supposed to trust? Tell us where you're listening from and your local time. We want to know how far these testimonies travel. If you believe mercy and memory matter, please subscribe to keep these stories alive. In the first week of April 1945, the war had not yet ended. But for a small farming village outside Gotha, Germany, it felt as if the world was holding its breath. The German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, who had occupied the roads and barns for months, were gone. They had vanished overnight, leaving behind an unnerving silence. 12-year-old Anna Keller stood at the window of her family's stone farmhouse, her mother's hand a tight, protective weight on her shoulder. For 3 years, the voice on the radio had prepared her for this day. It had painted a picture of the approaching enemy, the Americans, with dark and terrible colors. They were called the Yankees, a word that tasted like poison. The radio said they were men without honor, who took what they wanted and burned the rest. They were thieves who would steal the last of their potatoes, brutes who respected no woman, and monsters who would harm children without a second thought. Anna expected to hear the crash of a rifle butt against their door, the splintering of wood, the shouted commands in a language she could not understand. She braced herself for the violence that she had been promised would arrive with the American tanks. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, an ache that felt deeper than the constant, gnawing hunger. When the first American soldiers appeared at the edge of the village, they moved with a caution that was almost silent. They did not storm the houses. Instead, they walked slowly down the muddy lane, their rifles held ready but not aimed. Anna watched them from behind the lace curtain, her heart pounding against her ribs. They looked tired. Their faces were smeared with dirt and exhaustion, their uniforms a muddy green that blended with the spring fields. They were younger than she had imagined. One of them, a sergeant with 3 stripes on his sleeve, paused by their neighbor's fence and scanned the rooftops. He saw nothing but shuttered windows and silent chimneys. He gave a signal, and the other men lowered their weapons slightly. This was the first crack in the story Anna had been told. The monsters were not roaring, they were waiting. Then came the second crack, far more profound than the first. The sergeant, James O'Donnell of the 26th Infantry Division, unslung his pack and set it on the ground. He pulled out a small, foldable tin stove, something Anna had never seen before. Another soldier opened his own pack and produced several metal tins, the kind their own army used for rations. A hush fell over the other children who were now peeking from behind their own curtains. What were they doing? It was not looting. It was not destruction. It was something else entirely. A smell began to drift through the village, carried on the damp April air. It was a smell so foreign and so forgotten that for a moment, Anna could not place it. It was the scent of frying meat. The sergeant had set up the small stove and was now shaping patties of ground beef with his bare hands, placing them carefully on the hot metal surface. The sound, a low, gentle sizzle, was the only noise in the street. For weeks, the Keller family had survived on watery potato soup, thin and cloudy, with boiled nettles for substance. Their last loaf of bread had been eaten 10 days ago. The ache of hunger in Anna's belly was a constant companion, a dull throb that made it hard to think, hard to sleep. The memory of meat was a distant dream. Now, the smell of it filled the air, rich and savory, a promise of something that felt impossible. It was the first meat she had smelled in months. The contrast was dizzying. She had been taught to expect the smell of gunpowder and fire, the sounds of shouting and crying. Instead, she was met with the aroma of a hot meal and the soft murmur of the soldiers speaking to each other in low, calm voices. They were not yelling. A few of them were even smiling faintly as they watched the sergeant cook. One by one, the doors of the village houses opened a crack. Small, pale faces peered out. The American soldiers did not shout at them. They gestured, a gentle wave of the hand, an invitation. One of the soldiers tore open a packet of dry bread, the American equivalent of their own army hardtack, and laid the pieces out. When the first hamburger was cooked, the sergeant did not eat it himself. He placed it between 2 pieces of the bread and walked over to the nearest doorway, where a little boy no older than 6 stood shivering in a threadbare shirt. The sergeant knelt down, so his eyes were level with the boy's. He held out the food. The boy stared, first at the meat, then at the soldier's face. He looked back at his mother, who nodded, her eyes wide with disbelief. The boy took the hamburger, his small hands trembling as he lifted it to his mouth. Anna watched, her breath caught in her throat. She saw her own desperate hunger mirrored in his eyes. Another soldier began making more, and soon a small line of children had formed, drawn out of their homes by a need that was stronger than their fear. The soldiers moved among them, pressing the warm bundles into their hands. They moved with a gentleness that was utterly baffling. Anna felt her mother's grip on her shoulder finally loosen. She looked up at her face and saw tears welling in her eyes. It was then that the words left Anna's mouth, a whisper of pure astonishment that changed everything. She looked from the soldier's kind face to her mother's stunned one. "Mutti," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're actually so kind." The statement hung in the air between them, a fragile truth in a world built on lies. Her own belief system, so carefully constructed by the radio, by her teachers, by the entire country, had just shattered. If this was a lie, this story of the evil, monstrous enemy, then what else was a lie? What part of her world was real? Sergeant James O'Donnell watched the small German boy take his first bite of the hamburger. The boy's eyes, which had been dull with a weariness that did not belong on a child's face, widened with a jolt of flavor. For a moment, he looked less like the enemy, and more like Sergeant O'Donnell's own son back home in Boston. The same age, with the same thin shoulders. The memory was a sharp, painful ache. O'Donnell, like every man in the 26th Infantry Division, had every reason to hate the people in this village. He had lost friends in the endless, muddy slaughter of the Hurtgen forest, a battle that felt like it had been fought, tree by tree, man by man. The bitterness of that fight was a poison he carried in his bones. He was supposed to see these civilians as part of the machine that had cost him so much. Yet, as he handed another child a bar of soap from his pack, he saw only a boy with bare, dirt-caked feet and the quiet, desperate hunger that erased all lines on a map. He saw a human being. It was an act that went against every order he had been given, a choice that could have brought serious consequences for him and his men. Just weeks earlier, in March 1945, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had issued a strict policy that was repeated down every chain of command. It was the non-fraternization order. American soldiers were forbidden from interacting with German civilians beyond what was absolutely necessary for military operations. There were to be no friendly conversations, no shared cigarettes, and explicitly no sharing of army rations. The rule was born from a harsh pragmatism. The war was not over, and a smiling civilian could be hiding a sniper in their attic. Kindness could be twisted by enemy propaganda into a sign of weakness. To the strategists, maintaining a cold, professional distance was a matter of safety and discipline. But here, on the ground, that policy collided with a reality that was impossible to ignore. Starvation was not a strategic concept. It was the hollow look in a mother's eyes, the sight of children so weak they fainted in their own doorways. All around them, adults scavenged for turnips left rotting in the frozen fields. For soldiers like James O'Donnell, the choice was between obeying a rule made by generals miles away or answering the plea of a hungry child standing right in front of them. Anna finally made her way forward, her mother giving her a gentle push. One of the younger soldiers, a corporal with a kind smile, showed her how to hold the hamburger, tucked between the two pieces of coarse bread. She brought it to her lips, the smell making her feel dizzy. The first bite was difficult. Her jaw, accustomed to nothing but thin soup for so long, ached with the effort of chewing. The texture of the meat was strange and wonderful, and the warmth of the food spread through her, chasing away some of the cold that had settled deep inside her. The soldier watched her, and seeing her struggle, he chuckled softly. The sound was not mocking, it was gentle. Without thinking, a sound escaped Anna's own throat, a small, choked gasp that turned into a laugh. It was a foreign sound, one she had not made in months. The soldier's smile widened, and in that small moment, there were no uniforms, no enemies, no war. There was only a shared piece of food and a laugh. Later that day, Anna's mother, Marta, found a scrap of brown wrapping paper and a stub of a pencil. In the dim light of their kitchen, she wrote down what she had seen. They gave the children meat cooked with their own hands, she wrote. Not stolen, but offered. I saw no hatred in their eyes. She folded the paper carefully and hid it, a secret testament to a moment that defied everything she had been led to believe. That night, after the soldiers had moved on to set up their camp at the edge of the village, a new kind of fear settled over the Keller household. The warmth of the unexpected meal faded, replaced by a cold anxiety. Anna's uncle, Karl, who had returned wounded and bitter from the Eastern Front, sat grim-faced at the table. He had seen the hamburgers being handed out and had said nothing, but now his silence broke. He looked at Marta, his eyes hard. "You let them take it," he muttered. "You let them feed the child." His voice was low and rough with accusation. "Mercy from an enemy is never safe. Don't you know that? When the party officials hear of this, they'll say we collaborated. They will punish us for this tomorrow." His words fell like stones into the quiet room. The idea was terrifying. Could they be denounced for accepting a gift? Could an act of kindness be twisted into an act of treason? The doubt spread like a contagion. The soldiers had seemed kind, but perhaps kindness was just another weapon of war, a trick to lull them into a false sense of security before a crueler blow fell. The taste of the meat, which had been a moment of pure relief, now felt like a mark of shame, a dangerous secret that could bring ruin upon them all. The punishment Anna's uncle predicted never arrived. The next morning, the American soldiers were still there, their camp, a small, orderly collection of tents on the far side of the village green. The villagers watched them, a mixture of fear and a fragile, newfound hope churning within them. The official rules of the U.S. Army regarding civilian populations were clear. During an active combat advance, there was to be no organized distribution of food. The logistics were too complex, the risks too high. Aid was meant to come later, after the surrender was complete and military government teams could establish formal relief programs. Yet the scene in Gotha was not an isolated incident. All across the collapsing front in the spring of 1945, tens of thousands of individual soldiers bent those rules. They saw a level of civilian suffering that no regulation could account for, and they acted on a simple human impulse. In the records of the 90th Infantry Division, stationed in the neighboring region of Thuringia, an officer noted in his daily log that children were constantly lined up for scraps outside their field kitchens. In the forested hills of Bavaria, company cooks, often without direct orders, would sometimes prepare entire pots of stew, not for their own men, but for the skeletal inhabitants of the villages they passed through. These were not official acts of policy. They were quiet rebellions of conscience, carried out one meal at a time. As the day wore on, the fear in Anna's village slowly gave way to a cautious curiosity. The soldiers were not just handing out food, they were performing other small acts of kindness that chipped away at the wall of propaganda. A medic, a corporal named Bill Turner, noticed Anna's mother wringing her hands, the skin chapped and cracked raw from harsh soaps and endless work in the cold. Without a word, he approached her, his face calm and professional. He reached into his medical pouch and pulled out a clean roll of bandages and a small tin of ointment. He gestured for her to hold out her hands and gently began to treat the raw skin. Marta flinched at first, unused to such care from a stranger, an enemy. But the medic's touch was gentle, his movements efficient and kind. He showed her how to apply the ointment and wrap the bandages, a simple act of healing that felt as profound as the gift of food. It was another moment of impossible grace. These were the hands of a healer, not a destroyer. No one had ordered him to do it. It was simply a choice he made. Later that afternoon, another soldier sat on the steps of the abandoned village hall. He pulled a harmonica from his pocket, a small, silver instrument that glinted in the pale sunlight. He tapped it against his palm and then brought it to his lips. A melody filled the quiet air, a simple, sweet tune that Anna had never heard before. It was a song called "You Are My Sunshine." The music was gentle and sad, yet hopeful. The children of the village, drawn by the sound, gathered at a safe distance. They listened, their faces still serious but their eyes full of wonder. A few of the younger ones, forgetting their shyness, began to clap along to the rhythm. The soldier on the steps saw them and smiled, his playing growing a little livelier. For a few precious minutes, the war felt a world away. There were no guns, no orders, only a shared song in a quiet German village. When one of the men who had been cooking hamburgers earlier saw Anna watching, he paused. He looked at the half-eaten meal in her hand and said slowly, in broken German mixed with English, that back home, his wife made them with onions. He promised her that someday she would taste the real thing. The phrase stuck with Anna. It was a promise of a future, of a world where food was not a desperate necessity but a simple pleasure, a world beyond war. For that one day, the air in the village was filled with a sense of relief, so profound it felt like a dream. The soldiers asked for nothing in return. They simply shared what they had, treated the sore hands of a worried mother, and played music for children who had forgotten how to laugh. The warmth of these small mercies settled over the village, a temporary truce in a world defined by hatred. But the dream could not last. A few weeks later, in early May 1945, the news finally arrived. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But with the end of one conflict came the beginning of another. The soldiers of the 26th Infantry Division moved on, their place taken by new authorities. Soviet officers began to appear in their region, their presence marking the new reality of a divided Germany. Fear, which had briefly receded, came rushing back in. The new message was clear and cold. Do not speak of kindness from the Americans. Do not trust the memories of what happened. To do so was to be disloyal, to be an enemy of the new order. As the years went on, many Germans learned to bury these moments. The overwhelming narrative of the post-war era was one of suffering, shame, and cruelty. The small acts of compassion were dismissed as exceptions, statistical outliers in an ocean of violence. Some people, under the weight of guilt and public pressure, even came to deny they had ever happened at all. Near the city of Kassel, a woman who had been a displaced person would later write, "We had been told they would shoot us on sight. Instead, they fed us. Yet when we returned home, no one wanted to hear of it." The memory of a hamburger, of a gentle hand, of a simple song, became a dangerous truth, one that had to be hidden away in silence. Anna Keller grew up in the shadow of that silence. Her village, once on a fluid front line, now found itself firmly a part of East Germany. The world she knew was reshaped by a new government, a new ideology, and a new set of rules for remembering the past. Under the watchful eye of the Soviet-backed German Democratic Republic, the official story of the war's end was a simple, brutal narrative. The Americans, as part of the Western imperialist machine, were portrayed not as liberators, but as occupiers who had brought only terror and exploitation. To speak of an American soldier's kindness was not just an unpopular opinion, it was a political risk. It was a contradiction of the state-sanctioned truth, an act that could invite suspicion, questioning, and consequences for her and her family. And so, for decades, Anna kept the memory locked away. The taste of that first hamburger, the scent of frying beef in the spring air, the sound of a harmonica playing a gentle melody, these details became her private history, a story she could not share. The shame that her uncle had warned her about had finally arrived, not as a swift punishment, but as a long, slow-burning silence that dictated the shape of her memory. She learned to nod along with the official history, to live within the story she was given, even as a different truth pulsed quietly within her. The years passed. The Berlin Wall rose, and then, impossibly, it fell. Germany was reunified, and the world that had been frozen in place for half a century began to thaw. In 1995, Anna was no longer a 12-year-old girl, but a grandmother of 62. She sat in her own kitchen, a place of warmth and abundance that her younger self could never have imagined, surrounded by her grandchildren. They were learning about the war in their new, unified German schools, and they came to her with questions, full of a curiosity that was finally safe to express. One of them asked her what she remembered most about the end of the war, expecting a story of fear or hunger. Anna looked at their young, open faces, and the memory she had guarded for 50 years rose to the surface, clear and vivid. She decided that the silence had lasted long enough. "The first meat I tasted after the war," she told them, her voice steady and clear, "came from an American soldier's hand. He cooked it himself. He called it a hamburger." She saw the surprise in their eyes, the same disbelief she herself had felt all those years ago. But now, it was mixed not with fear, but with fascination. The story, once dangerous, was now just a story. It was her story, and for the first time, she was free to tell it. Her experience, once locked in the privacy of her memory, was part of a much larger, unspoken history. The Second World War was a conflict that produced oceans of cruelty, documented in excruciating detail in the history books. Its horrors are rightly remembered, its villains justly condemned. But within that vast landscape of violence, history often hides the millions of small, individual moments of mercy that occurred in defiance of it all. For every act of brutality, there was a quiet, unrecorded counterpoint. A shared cigarette between a guard and a prisoner, a word of comfort spoken across enemy lines, a decision to spare a life when an order demanded otherwise. Every bar of soap passed to a civilian, every bandage offered for a wound, every hamburger cooked for a starving child was a quiet rebellion. It was a rebellion not just against military orders, but against the very propaganda that fueled the war. The Nazi regime had spent years convincing its people that their enemies were subhuman monsters. The Allied leadership had insisted that a professional distance was necessary to maintain discipline. These small acts of humanity from individual soldiers shattered both narratives. They proved that honor was not found only in victory on the battlefield, but in restraint, in the choice to see the person in front of you, even when you were trained to see only an enemy. For Anna, the memory of 1945 never faded. Even in her old age, certain smells could transport her back to that muddy village lane. The scent of frying beef was not, for her, just the smell of food. It was the smell of a promise kept, of a lie being broken. It was the scent of dignity being restored to people who had been stripped of everything. It was the moment a girl who had been taught to hate was instead shown a simple, unexpected kindness. That single, humble meal did more than fill her stomach. It nourished a belief that even in the darkest of times, human decency could survive. For one starving child in a ruined country, mercy tasted like a hamburger. And that taste was proof that even in the middle of the most terrible war in human history, a single act of kindness could be louder and truer than the loudest lie.